Good afternoon and welcome everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance, good afternoon and welcome everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar on forest carbon and sustainable biomass harvests. This is the last event in our series of 5 Southeast Biocarbon Initiative webinars. To learn more about this series, please visit our website at www.cleanenergy.org and search for biocarbon, one word. My name is John Bonitz, and I'm the Staff Biomass Policy Specialist for SACE, the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Before we get started today, a few words on how this works. The Google Plus Hangout format is quite user-friendly and self-explanatory for those watching. To ensure sound quality, all attendees are muted throughout this presentation. We encourage you to please type in any questions throughout this event, and you may type those into the little box that says say something, or if you're watching on YouTube, the comment box. We will answer questions at the very end of the presentations today. In addition to this live broadcast, the entire webinar will be video recorded and posted to the YouTube account called SACE Clean Energy. So if you'll bear with me, I'll start the slides now. So, for those of you new to the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we are a regional nonprofit organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and I would like to thank and acknowledge our members on this webinar today, and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. Before I begin the presentations, I'll share a few words on the question of why we need biocarbon tools such as sustained forestry. The climate is experiencing instability and changes largely due to an excess of carbon pollution in the atmosphere. In fact, our skies now contain 400 parts per million of CO2, which is up from the 280 parts per million mark before the Industrial Revolution began. These are the highest concentrations in 800,000 years. It's clear that 350 parts per million is the target to restore a safe operating space for humanity. So how do we reduce the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere? How do we get back to safe levels? We can stop adding new carbon pollution, mainly by switching from fossil energy sources to clean energy like efficiency, wind power, and solar energy. But no amount of these energy sources can actually remove carbon from the air and put it somewhere safe. To do this, to get back to 350 parts per million, we also need biocarbon tools. We need to ally with nature and restore healthy natural systems around the world that can suck up carbon pollution from the air and store it in trees, plants, and soils. The co-benefits are great, and they will include a healthier economy, healthier people, and a healthier natural environment. So that's why we've gathered today to discuss forests as a way to store carbon and rebuild soil. Here's a short list of some things that forests can do to solve climate change. In terms of prevention of climate change, we can do wood substitution, biomass substitution for fossil energy sources, wildfire modification of woodlands. Avoided land use change is also very important. In terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we can both sequester carbon in forests and we can store carbon in long-lived wood products. And I've included the citation for this short list, which I commend folks to check out this short paper. It's a 39-page paper. And so now let's move on to introductions. With us today are Dr. Mark McGallis from North Carolina State University and Dr. Xander Evans, Research Director of the Forest Guild. I will introduce both of them and then ask Mark to begin his talk, and then that will be followed by Xander, and we'll address questions at the end. I do, again, encourage folks to type in your questions as we go, and look forward to a good discussion afterwards. Mark is an extension forestry specialist at North Carolina State University. He has degrees from Rutgers University and North Carolina State University. In his work helping forest landowners, his specialties include forest management, forest taxation, conservation planning, carbon valuation of forests, estate planning, general forest management, adaptation strategies for a changing climate. Just for fun, he enjoys backyard composting, gardening, canoeing, and bunny rescue. Dr. Xander Evans is the research director of the Forest Guild. The Forest Guild's mission is to promote ecologically, economically, and socially responsible forestry as a means of sustaining the integrity of forest ecosystems and the human communities that depend upon them. Dr. Evans directs and conducts research to support on-the-ground implementation of ecological forestry. His current research includes the effectiveness of fuels treatment and sustainability of forest bioenergy. He received his PhD from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies after working as a cartographer and spatial analyst with the U.S. Geological Survey. So, I will now move to Mark. Mark, you now have the floor, the control of the webinar. If you'll go ahead and unmute yourself and begin.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm broadcasting today from the Southern Research Station's Bent Creek Experimental Forest. They were kind enough to lend me an open room, so I'm glad to be here today. I just wanted to set the stage, as John had requested, to let you know really to what extent forests may be the answer to carbon sequestration and actually the reversal of carbon emissions. So going back to John's slide a couple of slides ago, we really have about 6 options on the table, some of which can stop the increase. Those first 4, which include using more wood versus concrete or steel, for instance, using more wood as a biomass substitution for fossil fuels, and I think we know about the efforts related to that. We can use good forest management to reduce some of the wildfire emissions. That's kind of the unknown quantity into the future. If we look at some of the projections for a 400 to 500% increase in the west of wildfires, we've got to do something collectively to reverse that. And then finally, keeping forests in forest is one of the best ways to prevent future emissions. So those are the top 4 to kind of slowing the increase or reducing the fossil fuel usage. So for those top 4, we'd be slowing the incline, if you will. And then the bottom 2, which we'll spend most of our time, hopefully your questions will facilitate a good discussion on this. We could talk about forests as a sequestration device, and that's what the slide presentations will talk about. And then towards the end, as we have time, looking at the long-term storage of carbon in wood. So we all know that wood could last a century. These are some things we can talk about. So John's going to give me the next slide, and I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you again. So I want to talk a little bit about the bright spot, what's happening currently, and we'll take a satellite view of the country and see where carbon is currently being sequestered and to what extent, from west to east, north to south. Look at some of the benefits of growing and burning more wood, if not burning it, utilizing it. And while it sounds easy on the surface, we'll take a look at some of the devil in the details. And then some of the future projections from some of the researchers here at the Southern Research Station, who are actually colleagues of mine upstairs in NC State, to talk about what the next 40 years might look like on their projections. I'll tell you right up front, it looks fairly good for the South as long as we can avoid further land use change. And then we'll talk about what the current state of the carbon forestry trading is. So we've got about 16 slides. If you'll sit back, get relaxed, and hold on for the ride. So a picture being worth 1,000 words, I wanted to show you one of the first pictorial assessments of essentially above ground carbon storage by our forests. So look for the dark green areas as those places that have the highest potential. And depending on the resolution on your slide, the lower boxes are zoomed in shots of, first of all, Pacific Northwest, the bottom one. Second one are the lake states, kind of a medium to least case scenario. The third one being the southeast, and then once again probably the next best case would be the northeast forests. So look for that green. We'll see it again in black and white in the next slide, just to make it a little clearer. So John, that was your prompt. There you go. So what we're talking about is thousands of metric ton equivalents per hectare. Well, you could cut that in half for those of you more comfortable on an acreage term. But look at our west coast forests, Pacific Northwest specifically in the coastal range, less so in the inland empire. As we move to the northeast, a lot of our big industrial forest acreage, but also our protected state natural, the Great North Woods, if you will, in the northeast. To a lesser extent in the upper lake states, but then as we come down the Appalachian mountain chain, nice, pretty bright spots in West Virginia, and then again for you Western North Carolinians and Great Smoky, Eastern Tennessee folks, you can see what old growth is doing there. So it's about old trees, but it's also about moisture. And as we look to the future, climate variability and the like, where we'll be able to sequester carbon is directly linked to where we've got water. Okay, next slide. So that was a quick look at above ground portions, and I think we intuitively know that as trees go older, they're going to take the carbon out of the air through photosynthesis and lock it up in wood and needles. But it's really below ground where we've got the most work to do in terms of understanding and probably the least clarity of really what's going on. So just like the first two maps we looked at above ground, this is the soil carbon, or essentially what's happening below ground. And the picture changes a little bit. Where we've got older forests, we've got a strong correlation with good soil carbon, but it's not always as uniform. What shows up more here, and this is where the southeastern coastal plain at least has some future merit, and also some problems potentially. It's most in the path of sea level rise, and so we're not sure what saltwater inundation will do to that carbon just yet. So that's a big unknown. But these darker areas on the southeastern coastal plain we could think of as our wetter or humic or organic soils. As they dry out, they're susceptible to fire, which gives us the same problem with our western forest types, especially on public land. But if they retain their moisture, they may be an important link in the future. And look at some of the numbers as we get into the deep reds. More than 100 kilograms per square meter. So you blow that up on a per hectare basis, and we're talking about a lot of carbon. So one of the secrets in the future is to keep that carbon in the ground, and to the extent that we can figure out how to do it, is add more to it. And I think some of the previous sessions, the first four, probably got into biochar and amending certain soils with more carbon. But as we learn that, we get a different appreciation and a better scatter of across the country, where we could even in our wheat or corn basket opportunities to improve soil carbon there, and then again in our northeast and Pacific Northwest forests. The big unknown in the future as temperature increases, you remember from your ecology days, longer growing seasons or warmer temperatures, especially in the Arctic, are the big unknowns for the release of soil carbon. So It looks like a pretty simple question, but when you get into the details, it quickly spirals out of control what we do not know. So next slide. So this again is a recap of the carbon cycle depending on how much clarity you have. Um, the circle to the right is pretty much the sustainable forestry story. We start with bare land or after a harvest, and we can be fairly sustainable. And carbon taken off as solid wood products is quickly accumulated in the stretch of a typical rotation. What we'll spend more time in on the next slide and the remainder of the discussion is what happens when the wood leaves the forest. We've got some potential uses. You can go to the next slide because I think it's a little more clear. This is essentially the center of that diagram. We could spin it off as bioenergy, and in some cases that makes a lot of sense. We'll get into some of the detail. If we can do it locally and effectively and keep our transportation and manufacturing costs to a minimum, we've got a great story there. To the left fork, I think we have a real good opportunity as a nation and a global community to start thinking about wood as a long-term solution. We know that wood can last a century if properly taken care of. We may start needing to build that into our structure building codes to really favor wood for a number of reasons. Not only are we taking it out of the forest and giving the forest an opportunity to resequester ancient carbon into new life forms, but we can also lock up that carbon without it getting back into our solid waste facilities or municipal dumps, if you will, where it'll come back as methane and haunt us 25 times greater, or as I heard today, up to 125 times the impact.
Mark, I've lost your audio. Mark, I'm not able to hear you. Are you still with us? Mark is still appearing in the Google Hangout, but okay, Mark is logging back in again. Please bear with us, folks. He'll be right back with us in just a moment, I suppose. And then we'll recommence where he was speaking about. Here we go. Thank you, Mark, for getting back with us. Go back to your slides. You were on the slide of carbon cycle. We're still not able to hear your voice.
John, can you hear me?
Here we go. Now we've got you.
Sorry about that. It looked like the network went down for a moment. So we can get back to the slides. Wherever I left off, I'll try to resume.
I should have you on your second carbon cycle slide. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't see it yet, but all I see is you. But from that second slide, we're about to move to the third one. So if we caught that discussion a little earlier, I just wanted to make the point that depending on how we extract the forest, our first plan is not to let it go up in smoke, but then our decision as a community is to decide whether it goes into bio energy substitution or a long-term wood product. And I hope that came through, that we have to decide as a group, is it in our best interest to sequester that carbon in a long-term wood product use that could last for centuries? In my mind, that's a good way to go. So John, I'm not seeing slides. Maybe you can help me through that.
Okay, I'm hoping that I am broadcasting. There's a delay on my monitor. I'm double checking through my phone to make sure that we are indeed broadcasting. There's a delay, but based on my controls, I do have the slides showing doing the math on forest products, the life cycle inventory assessment.
Okay, I know what that slide looks like, so I'll talk to it and you keep working on it. But one of the things that has enlightened the discussion on forest carbon and emissions in general is to go through what's called the life cycle assessment, or on this slide it may also be known as an inventory. But it's a true carbon accounting from cradle to grave on products. So that involves the energy or carbon involved in growing the product, cultivating it, harvesting it, transporting it to a manufacturing facility, all the energy inputs, carbon if you will in this case, involved in that, and then there we go. It's total distribution or destruction if you will. Where does it end up in the consumer usage? And then finally, as it's disposed of, does it go into a landfill where it may decompose that could be more problematic? And is that methane captured and reused or sparked off, as we're seeing in many of the fracking pictures of late? So they're related to air emissions, water, solid waste, and as you can imagine. What we're finding in some of our uses of wood, it's the transportation and harvesting and procuring it and moving it to its final part, whether that be a solid wood, paper, or more recently the discussions involving pellets. Turns out that if we can procure that wood closely, most of the energy that's involved in its manufacturing into a densified pellet is at the manufacturing stage, and the cost of shipping it over to Europe is not as great as one would assume. So it's the harvesting and essentially the manufacturing, the drying and pelletizing of it, where all that life cycle majority comes from. So we'll look at the next slide and move on from there. So let's look at the future. I told you a little bit about the researchers here. Dr. David Ware has been in charge of what we call the RPA, or the Rural Planning Assessment. It's got a longer title, but I put the citation here. What you have in front of you is 3 or 4 future climate projections. The Hadley model, the A1, B2, and all of those ad nauseum. What you want to look at is the curve here and the big differentiation on them. Remember, we said one of the key things and one of the key aspects of this report is for the South to continue to sequester carbon. Job one is to avoid future land use changes. So where we've got forests, we've got to keep them in forest. Where we've got forests, they've got to improve for the forest loss. They've got to improve in growth to offset the forest loss. And to the extent that we can do that, the report says in the next slide, these are the findings specifically for the Deep South. We can keep it to a static level if we're lucky, and if we keep we avoid that land use change. And what happens is the early growth, at least in the early period of those 4 decades, is going to offset any land use changes to a large extent. The not so bright part of this report is that there's little opportunity to expand the standing forest carbon pools. So based on those earliest pictures at the beginning of the presentation, imagine the map of the North America, or at least the U.S. portion of it. Southeast has got the standing forest carbon it's likely to have into the future. And nationwide, this is a pretty significant thing. We're already offsetting about 13% of our air emissions or carbon emissions. So what we need to look at in the future then, at this last bullet, is we don't necessarily have the policy. So put that on our to-do list, John and Xander, and we can talk about that as a question at the end. So the South is okay for the short term. Depending on what the future shows, our ability to sequester additional carbon looks to be in jeopardy.
Mark, I'm sorry, we did drop your feed, your voice feed, just a moment there on the last bullet. You were saying we do not currently have any policy, and you went blank.
Okay, we don't have a policy in place to retain or to foster our landowners, who are the bulk of the forest ownership in the Southeast, to sequester additional carbon. So I think one of our conclusion slides at the end suggests that we can't do it by avoiding harvesting. Harvesting and aggressive forest management has to be part of that solution. But until we have a policy in place, we're going to have to rely on the existing market to grow trees as fast as we can. And then for the marketplace to look for longer term usages where we can lock up that carbon for a long time. Paper recycling comes to mind, but we've got to keep it out of the landfill. Okay, so John wouldn't let me leave today without talking about some of those existing policy trading opportunities that are in place. The biggest and broadest, if we stay on our hemisphere, is what's taking place currently in California with their air board. They do have an active climate registry, and forestry is a big component of that. There exist other market opportunities, largely on the voluntary side. And the way forestry is playing currently is through new reforestation, putting trees on lands that heretofore had been cleared, but it makes sense that we can restore or rehabilitate those forests by replanting. So we'll get into some of the gritty details about that. Another shining opportunity, and we're seeing a lot of protected and conserved tracts go into the California program through sustainable forest management. This is the case where through an FSC certification, forest stewardship certification program, or our North American Sustainable Forestry Initiative, landowners or ownerships agree, public and private, to do an enlightened, if you will, version of forest management where they're accounting for carbon, and the goal is to sequester more carbon through a sustainable management regime. So that can include selective harvest, longer rotations, but by and large just an accounting of what's taken off and removed, with the goal of always building the principle, if you will, and only harvesting from the interest. The final one, and we've had a lot of activity even here in North Carolina, to get credit for the trees that have been grown on site, where there's an opportunity to strip that land and put it into agriculture or some other use. And to the extent that that conversion is avoided, the marketplace has rewarded folks who've put a conservation easement in place, opted for sustainable or restricted harvesting into the future, and they have entered the carbon marketplace using those things. I will note with that last bullet that one of our greatest opportunities, and one that's been hardest to put our finger on, is a means of recognizing that opportunity to sequester carbon in long-lived wood products. So the next three slides are just a little bit of detail, well, too much detail perhaps, explaining how California goes through that process. And I won't read this to you, but I will point out a few things, one of which the 30-year time frame pops up a couple places. the notion of tree planting, not following a commercial harvest. So this was essentially new trees or afforestation. And this program is available to private and public lands, but I just point out number 4, no use of broadcast fertilizer. So I guess they're already taking into account some of the carbon life cycle analysis, and they don't want to give you credit for growing trees a little faster than normal if there's going to be deleterious use of fossil fuels to make that happen. So this will be in your slide set, and I encourage you to look at it specifically or to go to the CAR site for more details. So that's putting new trees where they haven't been before. The second one is improved or sustainable forest management. Again, the idea is to have an enlightened approach where carbon is the driver as opposed to economics specifically. Many of these things require not just being in a certification plan program, not just having a forest management plan, but actually securing the land with a conservation easement or a long-term avoidance of land use change. And that the improved forest management too is available on private and public lands. So you'll see some enrollment even from states have been aggressive on this, but also conserve private lands and those with longer rotation or an incentive to extract some cash on the front end and make these deals go through. So that's sustainable forestry management. The last one is avoided conversion, and we'll get into some of those details. Even smaller text, so you might have to look at this close. But the idea is to retain the continuous forest cover that's already in place and get credit for that. This one too avoids any broadcast fertilizer. But to date, this option is only available on privately owned properties. And that kind of makes sense. Most public entities are not into the conversion mode, and that it would be hard to prove additionality or the carbon that would be protected as not having taken place during normal activities. So this has to be new, and the threat has to be documented and in it. So those are the 3 current programs. I will wrap up, let you know that most of them to date have worked on the larger tracks. There's a lot of due diligence and front-end cost to document a baseline to account for the carbon that's there in a pretty intensive way. I think you have to prove within a 10% accuracy the extent that the carbon's there, and then repeatedly prove that, if not annually, every couple of years to ensure that that carbon has not dissipated. So I've included this picture of a couple of my favorite German foresters. The fellow on the right is a logger. He works in the equipment side. The fellow on the right, I said. The fellow on the left is actually a sawyer. He cuts to specifics. I just thought they embodied the tough approach that we'll need to take and look at what the options are to the future. So let's see what we put in these concluding slides. Since you didn't hear, I didn't want you to hear just from me today. These last 2 slides come from a couple of quick reports. One from a few years back in looking at California's forests. And this was the discussion earlier about what are the opportunities. And they think forest management is the way to go. Utilizing more wood products, especially to the extent that it substitutes for fossil fuels, is the way to go. They do not encourage and do not see any benefit from prohibitions on harvesting. And I think for those of us who know that forestry is such a dynamic resource, we want to take advantage of all the things that forests sector provides, the management opportunities for biomass fuel, for instance, the opportunities to reduce wildfire, all those key points we initiated early on or discussed. And to keep the forest industry viable, I mean, that's one of the things that's threatening California forests, just the viability of their existing wood-using infrastructure, the industry itself. So that's from California back 7 years ago. Let's see what the next slide talks about. So this one is from the impact of climate change on America's forest, and there was a chapter specifically on carbon sequestration by Birdsey and Joyce. The reference is there. So we can increase the sequestration to the stock of carbon in forest products. We've talked about that. Without increasing the aggregate consumption of wood. So in this case, it's actually changing the or increasing the product use life. This makes sense in the long-term wood products, but by recycling. And then this third one is to put that solid wood into longer-term products like paperboard or paper, which decays a lot slower in the landfill. So we're avoiding those methane gases into the future. But we can do this long-term through the genetic change of the makeup of trees themselves, so they're slower to decay. And even if you think about wood treatment opportunities, those long-term options to keep creosoted railroad ties in place are now some of the new borates. The wood that we use can have a longer life. And this is coming out of the Forest Products Laboratory, so you kind of get the bent of where they're headed. So next slide, I think we're going to save the questions to later, but here's my contact information if you need more details on that. And I will hopefully give over the talk to Xander and see what he has to say, and I'll remain on the line for questions. I do appreciate your time.
That was great, Mark. Thank you so much. Yes, and Xander, if you're ready, then oh, we need to quickly get to your slides. Here we go. Sorry, Xander, I went too quickly, and you'll need to unmute yourself. There you are.
Yep, that's fine. We'll just start here. Let's see. This is based on a talk I gave at the SAF convention last fall, and I'm going to take a complementary, hopefully, but different sort of starting point than Mark was using, and I really want to think about what's happening on the forest side as we think about using parts of the forest, parts of the trees that we didn't traditionally use, in maybe substituting some of these wood products for fossil fuels or other energy sources. So let's jump to the next one, John. So the idea is to talk a little bit about biomass harvesting guidelines, and so these are guidelines designed to guide how we harvest this low-value material, and I want to talk them both at sort of the national level, looking at some state and regional guidelines, but also particular examples from the Southeast. And then at the end, I'll sort of rush through some of this stuff, but at the end, I want to put it in a little bit of a national and international context, which Mark teed up very nicely with some of his discussion of things like pellets. So let's jump to the next one, John. And actually, you can skip this one.
Okay.
So the first key thing is to lay out what I'm talking about when I say woody biomass or biomass in general. And from a technical perspective, it's all the material, living or dead, in the forest, right? So it's everything out there in this picture. But when colloquially, sort of in common parlance, when we use the term biomass, really what we're talking about is stuff that didn't have a traditional market or had a very low value, so even below pulp and sort of the hierarchy of wood products. And that's really what I'm referring to, and that's really where we're honing in. So Mark talked about a whole range from, saw timber going into buildings and getting locked up that way, or paper products. And I'm really focused in on a particular low value element that's been targeted for energy production. So let's jump to the next slide. And very quickly we get to the question of, well, why do we need guidelines for the harvest of this material? And it's really an extension of why we try to do good forestry in any case. Good biomass harvesting practices give us a chance to really enhance the land. But at the same time, if we have poor practices, we run into some problems. And these can be biodiversity problems, these can be carbon problems, and so as well as public perception problems. And so the guidelines are designed to try to focus our use of wood for energy in a way that enhances the land rather than damaging it. Next slide, please. And the other reason that we might want to think about having biomass harvesting guidelines is that previous best management practices tend not to include thinking about some of the material that we're now focused on for energy production. So we got a lot of great best management practices out there. Generally, they're focused on water quality, driven by the Clean Water Act. But as they were written, the folks writing them and thinking about them didn't necessarily envision these future markets that are now beginning to emerge. Next slide, please. And a number of states have taken it upon themselves to address these concerns. Minnesota was the first, but you see this list peering up on the slide here. There are lots of them out there. The most recent that I know of is South Carolina. And so all of these guidelines are sort of recognizing that as new markets emerge, we may have new concerns. And so you can see that the lake states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, were some of the first and most comprehensive, but that's spread to other areas. And now it's beginning to have some impact in the Southeast, Kentucky, South Carolina. We haven't seen as much happen on the West Coast, and I think that's driven by folks listening in from the West Coast will know that there are already pretty stringent forest practice rules in California, for example. But there are also some moves. There's some working groups thinking about how those existing forest practices rules might relate to biomass harvesting concerns. So I think we'll see this list grow over time. Next slide, please. And I think it's important as we think about biomass harvesting guidelines to think about how they connect to existing certification systems. And I just picked two, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative and the Forest Stewardship Council as examples, but we could look at Tree Farm or others as well. And both of these certification systems call for the maintenance of forest attributes such as trees declining in health, snags, downwoody material, habitat trees, etc., stumps, but they don't necessarily provide foresters on the ground or landowners thinking about a harvest with the specifics they might need to actually put those requirements into a prescription. And so I think there's a lot of room for biomass harvesting guidelines to dovetail with requirements from certifiers. So if you have an auditor come out onto your land and they're looking down their list of indicators or protocols and they say, well, we need to make sure that there's enough, say, snags out there, or down wood is maybe a better example, but the auditor may not have a good sense of what is the natural amount of dead wood, or how much dead wood do we need out there for all these other concerns from carbon to wildlife that we might not have had when he or she was in school. Next slide, please. So the hope is that biomass harvesting guidelines can supplement that. And when we did a look at the existing biomass harvesting guidelines, there's a fair amount of overlap on the kinds of things that they cover. And so I don't want to go into all the details of this chart. It's probably too small to see anyway. But the topics, in many cases, are very similar. And so as I'm talking about some of these things, that's why these topics come up again and again, because whether it's states or other agencies or organizations are all aiming for some of the same goals. Next slide, please. And so I'll kind of hit on some of those main themes here. I think we need another click here. Yeah, there we go. So one of them is dead wood. As we think about markets for material that we haven't previously used, well, what happened in the past with that material? Well, it ended up left in the forest as dead wood, either fine material, small branches, or larger logs. Without a market, there was no reason to take it out, so it accumulated. Next slide. So that's one thing that may change as we have biomass markets, particularly for energy. There are some wildlife and biodiversity concerns, and those are often brought up in these biomass harvesting guidelines. Next click, please. We have water quality and riparian issues, although many of these are dealt with by existing best management practices, as I mentioned earlier. Next click, please. And in some cases, biomass harvesting guidelines address soil productivity. And this ties, I think, very closely to some of the comments Mark was making earlier on about one of the places we really can get some carbon stored across the country is in our soil. And that's a real repository for carbon. And so if we're doing things, we don't want to have the unintended consequence of stripping some of our soil productivity by the way we're doing our harvests for energy. The other thing that I want to tie back to Mark's presentation, he highlighted that some of the carbon storage protocols require or forbid the use of broadcast fertilizer. So in that scenario, we have to think a little bit more carefully about what we're taking off the site in terms of site nutrients. And so this soil productivity, site productivity issue might be in more stark terms if we're in a situation where we're trying to sell our carbon. Next click, please. The last piece of the biomass harvesting guidelines, silviculture operations, those can also come up. Not that they are necessarily only driven by biomass harvesting, but because this is sort of thinking about how forestry happens, it's a chance to think about how to do it right. Next click, please. So as we think about dead wood, why do we care about? Well, its habitat, its nest sites, it improves aquatic habitat, it's an issue for regeneration. As I just was talking about, it releases nutrients back into the soil. It can be facilitate fungus and mycorrhizae, which also relates to nutrients. It can decrease runoff and erosion, nitrogen fixation. There are other issues, things like even deer browse. By leaving material around in certain distributions and certain quantities of deer out on the land, you can affect regeneration that way. Next click, please. So dead wood has a big role to play, and it's not something we've thought about a lot in the past. It's not been high on our list because there wasn't a market that would affect its quantity out in the forest. So if we want dead wood, the next obvious question is how much to leave? And if you just look at some of the existing guidelines, Maine, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Missouri, they all recommend different amounts. And there are a lot of different ways of thinking about amounts. Do you think about the fine woody material, as in Maine, FWM is fine woody material, or do you think about the amount of trees harvested and sort of relate it to that? And it would be Minnesota's approach. Or just a straight tonnage, which was Wisconsin's approach. So there are different ways of thinking about this, and each state has its own approach that hopefully will be honed over time as more science comes out. But the goal of all this is to protect those attributes we talked about on the previous slide. Next slide, please. So I want to just touch briefly on some of the work that I've been doing with the Forest Guild and other partners like the Environmental Defense Fund. We put together thinking about, okay, in the Southeast, what does the science say? What does the best available science say about what sorts of dead wood we need? How can we use that to better understand what we should be doing in the woods? Next slide, please. So that's available on our website, and I can share that link. But as we look through the literature to kind of pull together all the science we could, we realized that there are some associations between small mammals, as listed here, and coarse woody material on the ground. But that's not as true for reptiles. So there were some biodiversity issues. Next slide, please. And we tried to, as we did this work, we tried to break it out by ecoregions because obviously the Piedmont and coastal plain is different than the Appalachian hardwoods. And so we also saw, as you kind of synthesize some of the existing literature, you see that the biodiversity implications are different as well. In this case, the Piedmont and coastal plain pinelands, there's some connection that people have found in the literature between arthropods as well as small mammals and some of this coarse woody material. Next slide, please. This does change a little bit when we look at the reptiles. They're not particularly associated to coarse woody material. So they're winners and losers here as we think about effects of removing or changing the pattern of dead wood in our forest. Next slide, please. And the research here is ongoing. I want to highlight some great work that's happening at North Carolina State University. They have a big project, and the results are coming out now. There have been some webinars that maybe some of you have attended on some of their recent results, but they're really trying to improve our knowledge about these and answer some of the questions that when we did our initial synthesis weren't available. So next slide, please. Some of their results, these are just some images of some of the posters. I'm not expecting anyone to read this, but some of what they've found is that they're not seeing the kind of huge negative impacts so long as some coarse woody material or down woody material is left on site. Next slide, please. And so it'll be important to integrate these new results into our thinking and our guidance for landowners and harvesters. So in this case, the preliminary results indicated no effect of down woody removal on amphibians, birds, or reptiles. So that gives us some confidence that we can remove some of this material, some of this biomass, without negatively affecting at least these guilds or these categories of species. Next slide, please. So based on this science, the Forest Guild came up with some guidelines for the Southeast, and I'll just step through these quickly. Next slide, please. The team that developed them was made up of myself as well as a number of practicing foresters in the Southeast. I think we need another click here. And the idea was to both bring together that on-the-ground experience to add some reality to the recommendations, and at the same time encourage the protection of these attributes. Next click, please. So as we wrote these guidelines, we were thinking of a number of audiences, as you can see on the slide, and they're not meant to the Forest Guild guidelines. We're a nonprofit. We're not trying to supersede what the states are doing or anything like that, but we thought that it would help. We thought that by putting these together would be, we could take, because we're not connected to any particular state but have a national view, we can look at ecoregions that might be more difficult for an individual state. And we don't have the number of stakeholders who might try to influence the process one way or another, because there are lots of opinions on this. So we felt we could rely on the science and top-rate professionals and come up with the best, from our view, the best possible solution. Next click, please. And I should emphasize that this is from our perspective, and so the Forest Guild really focuses on ecological forestry, and so some might see these guidelines as not meeting their particular goals, and that's fine. We did these guidelines also because our members needed them to do the right thing for their land. Next click, please. So one of the things that we talked about first in the Forest Guild guidelines were sensitive sites, sites that are rare or unique, and we talked a lot about, well, you know, those are sites you should just stay out of. But then we realized that biomass harvests are actually a great tool. And an example I might throw out for the Southeast is longleaf restoration. In cases where you're removing biomass to return a natural fire interval or something, you may need to actually take out a lot of material, and it may not be high quality. So having a biomass market may facilitate this restoration. So that's sort of the point of this slide here. Next slide, please. Obviously, we talked about retention of downwoody material. I've been harping on its importance. And these are some general recommendations. We also provided some specific recommendations. Next slide, please. With the idea that you need both sort of an overarching way to think about dead wood on a site as well as some specific targets. And we recognize the ability of professional foresters to juggle lots of competing objectives as they're working in the woods. And so this graphic is one way we thought we could try to help professional foresters think about these issues. So maybe we have a target, sort of a all things being equal, let's leave a third of the slash we generate in the harvest on site. But where we know that there's already a lot of existing dead wood on site, maybe there are a lot of old logs on the site, we don't need to leave as much. If we know that we're not going to come back to the site for a long time, it's an infrequent harvest, again, maybe we don't need to leave as much. On the flip side, if it's a nutrient poor site, we're probably going to want to leave a lot more. If it's a clear cut, a full removal, then we're probably going to want to leave more as well, because it's going to be longer before that stand has natural mortality or other inputs of dead wood, and vice versa. So this is a quick heuristic to think about how we adjust for all the site variables. Next slide, please. And it's important to point out that the guidelines are just that. They're guidelines. They're not a fixed rule, and they're not backed by any laws or anything. We're trying to add some guideposts on this long-term path towards sustainability. Next slide, please. So here are the specific targets I was mentioning. We feel that unless you can pull out a a measurable quantity with which to compare a site you're working, it doesn't really help you that much. Going back to the idea of auditing and certification, unless you have an actual target that an auditor could actually verify, it doesn't help much. So that's where these targets come from. They're based on the literature, which you can sort of connect to via the guidelines themselves, and will change as we can integrate, say, the new information from North Carolina State University and other places as it comes out. These will probably be adjusted. Next slide. So this is just a quick reminder that, well, we do include some comments about water quality. Basically, water quality is addressed by existing Clean Water Act best management practices. There are some things like leaving some slash on site to reduce overland flow and that sort of thing that might be particularly relevant to biomass harvest. But next slide, please. We do make some comments in the guidelines about harvesting operations involving a professional forester, trained loggers, and these are things for us at the Forest Guild are like motherhood and apple pie. They're just things you do, any chance you get, you push for a professional forest bit, because we feel that that's how you have good forest practices and keep forests healthy. Next slide, please. So this is almost exactly what Mark was saying earlier. We're trying to encourage keeping forests as forests. That's a mantra. If there's one thing we can all agree on, regardless of where you're coming from, whether it's a carbon perspective, biodiversity perspective, forest products perspective, keeping forests as forests is key. None of this works as it gets parcelized, fragmented, or converted. So we feel that biomass actually can be a tool to help keep forests as forests, where landowners are getting a little bit of extra money, helping pay their harvest costs for higher quality products via biomass. It may help keep forests as forests. But we have to make sure that we're not using biomass as an excuse or as a way to convert forest to non-forest uses. Next slide, please. So I want to jump into a little bit of a policy context. I hope I'm not taking too long. I'm sure John will cut me off here if I go too far. Go ahead and click.
You're doing fine.
Okay, thanks, John. Go ahead and so this is, I just threw up some images, and I think we'll try a couple of clicks here, John. Just some images of some of the kind of policy issues that I've seen come across my desk. Various decisions about the carbon accounting for biomass, maybe one more click here, both at the state level in Massachusetts or the EPA level, and then there's some stuff in the European Union that is impacting particularly the Southeast. So, and this actually kind of coming around full circle connects with Mark's presentation on how we think about carbon and how we do some of the carbon accounting. Let's go on to the next slide. One of the big markets now, I guess, well, yeah, thank you, is pellets. We all know that the pellets from the Southeast are one of the big ways that we're changing forests into energy. And this has created a fair amount of backlash, and I put up some examples from Dogwood, NRDC, and Greenpeace to remind ourselves that it's not occurring in a vacuum. There are a lot of other players engaged in this conversation, and one of the reasons why we're thinking about biomass harvesting guidelines is that if we don't do this right, if we don't leave forests better than we found them, if we don't take into consideration the biomass or the biodiversity impacts of using biomass for energy, then the public is not going to put up with it. And so these kinds of campaigns, I think, are very relevant to the conversation. And I'm not saying that just by employing the Forest Guild's biomass harvesting guidelines is going to satisfy these groups, but hopefully there is a middle ground where we can say, look, by using the best available forest science and best practices, we can take the argument away from people who would prefer not to see any trees cut and say, look, we're doing a good job and it's meeting our carbon goals. Go ahead and click again, please. So I think that sort of wraps up what I wanted to cover here. I'm hoping there's some time for conversation and discussion and questions. I'll leave on this note of why we do these biomass harvesting guidelines in the first place, because I think that that's sort of a good touchstone here for the conversation. So with that, John, I think I'm all wrapped up.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Sander, for those comments, and thank you, Mark, also for queuing us up on forest carbon. We are at the question and answer phase of the presentation. We have a window that is open until 1:30, and I am not seeing any questions that have been typed in. Let me check one other interface, but I do have some questions that I've made note of as I've been listening. The first one, going back to Mark's presentation, I'm curious, Mark, you mentioned the use of wood and the possibility of increasing the use of wood in long-lived wood products for storing carbon outside of the current carbon cycle. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that and the opportunities you see there.
Glad to, John. One of the things that comes to mind, and it's got a fair amount of press, largely from the Canadians and elsewhere, and that's the notion of a brand new engineered product called cross-laminated timbers. And if you can imagine, I think it's called Jengi or some kind of toy where you stack up different logs together. That's essentially what cross-laminated timbers are. You're taking the strength of existing solid wood boards and gluing them up in maybe 3 or 4 plies. And the idea is that using a heck of a lot of wood, but you're creating maybe one of the stronger, lightest, most renewable building products that can withstand fire, can withstand earthquake shaking, but it's strong enough and efficient enough that you could build skyscrapers, if you will, or at least to date, I think they're 10-story wood projects that are exclusively made of wood, but not in the stick-built fashion. They're going to come as pre-manufactured walls that are raised by a crane and put into place. So unlike existing skyscrapers where you're adding a floor a day and waiting a week for that concrete to cure, you can stack up 3 or 4 stories in a given day. And there's a couple pilot projects, but it's getting a lot of advances. And if we could think about how many things that checks off, is first of all wood substitution instead of concrete and steel. But it has the opportunity to store wood products for potentially a century and more. And as some of the wood advocates are clear to remember, that the fireproof ability of wood is pretty substantial when you get into a large dimensional stock. So the old Chicago warehouses that were built of southern pine were 14 and 18-inch timbers, and one of the reasons they were deployed, it was after the Chicago fire. The Spiegel catalog from days gone by, some of those big warehouses were made of wood specifically after the Chicago fire because of their fireproof ability. So that's what we'd go back to, building with wood in an organized structural way. and looking at the longer term, not just from carbon accounting, but true accounting. What are the maintenance costs? What are the life cycle analyses of these things? And the beauty of them, if the building must be torn down, it can be repurposed and probably have another lifetime. So these things give me hope, in a future that's truly uncertain. So that's just one example. And thanks for that question.
Excuse me. Yeah, and thank you, Mark. And also, before we began the webinar, in the green room, Mark and I were chatting, and we were thinking about, if all of these policy efforts we may need to take some drastic action. So what would be kind of an emergency carbon storage effort? And Mark, you mentioned the concept of cutting large timber and inundating that wood in swamps and lakes. And as a forester, as a North Carolinian, as a Southerner, I'd like you to, if you would, just tell us, how might this actually look? Where might it take place in the Southeast, and how?
So it's crazy enough idea, John. We might need to consider it. So in a nutshell, John and I were talking about what would be the ideal way to secure wood in a long-term situation where it would not be exposed to the elements that would degrade it and put the carbon back up into the atmosphere. So one of my colleagues talks about the ideal sequestration is to cut and dry wood and wrap it in cellophane and then deep six it until such time as we need it or the like. And I thought of a shorter term opportunity along the lines of our strategic petroleum reserve, that if we really were interested in having trees sequester as much carbon as possible, we'd look at forest from I know this is almost heretical to discuss it, but if our trees have done all the sequestration they're going to do, if we could harvest them and put them in a locked box of sorts, and the one that came to mind are these deep organic soils, where many times in clearing a field, you're going to plow up, or through subsidence and draining, you're going to see a log that's 2,000 or 3,000 years old and is largely intact and could go to the sawmill tomorrow if cleaned up. Why not do the same thing? Just bank our timber when it's available at the cheapest prices, support the infrastructure, and then save it for a rainy day, maybe then 3 generations hence, if you will, just to put a big dent in that 400 parts per million, which seemingly is rising another 3 parts per million per year. And with population change, that could easily go to 3, 4, or 5 parts per million. So we've got to slow the rise, but we also have to be looking long term at some serious ways of bringing that carbon back out of the atmosphere if we're going to live in a world that we've become accustomed to in this generation and generations henceforth. So there'll be winners and losers. Maybe the trees are the solution, but we're going to have to work together as a community to look at viable options. That one may not be so viable, but it gives you a straw man to shoot at. So thanks for putting me on the spot, John.
I think you put it in the right context. It's a crazy idea and a straw man, but we live in pretty extreme times. Xander, I'd like to circle back to something that you mentioned very briefly in the context of incentives or possible policies that might encourage or actually oversee management options. You mentioned that there might be a possible drawback to disallowing fertilization of certain wood stands, but I believe that nitrogen would be the greatest problem that, to my knowledge, I'm not being a soil scientist, nitrogen applications would exacerbate greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, there's the life cycle the petroleum implications, fossil fuel implications of making that nitrogen fertilizer. But what would you think of forest soil amendments other than nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, micronutrients, and trace elements, such as through the return of wood ash to the forest? Just for speculation purposes, what would you think?
So I guess in terms of finance and sort of ease, for me, if you can keep the nutrients you have on site, and allow the forest to regenerate naturally, you don't have to, in many cases, you don't have to worry about adding fertilizer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of my starting point. Obviously, this varies significantly across the country, and then even from one side of a hill to another, and what kind of agricultural history you're dealing with on the site, or the parent material. So the starting point and sort of where we came at it from with the guidelines is let's do the things we can to keep those nutrients on site. And in many cases, having forests on a piece of ground over time improves the site quality, particularly in comparison when you're looking at a starting point that's a sort of abandoned agricultural system. So all that said, I think that there are some possibilities, and it needs to be put into the context that Mark was talking about, which is a full life cycle analysis. So if you're thinking about adding things in, you want to think about, well, as you alluded to, John, what are our costs in generating this material that's going to go on site, regardless of the actual fertilizer, and what's the expected payoff? And I think there probably are sites and individual cases where it makes a lot of sense to invest a little money, a little carbon up front to produce a lacking nutrient, and get it on site so that you can improve your growth by X%, and then sequester that carbon, get a return on your investment. But I think it should be done, those decisions should be made in a full life cycle assessment. And I think that there are ways, I know one of your interests is biochar, and I think there are ways where we can think about tighter loops rather than going off-site to bring in fertilizers. I think I've seen people talking about various efforts to generate biochar essentially in an in-woods environment. And it kind of ties in with the previous question about how do we lock up carbon. Well, one easy way to lock up carbon is by turning it into charcoal. And so I think there are probably good cases where you can, with relatively low energy inputs and relatively low carbon or cost, generate charcoal from material in the woods, get it back into the soil as an amendment that would also lock up carbon. But all the pieces, you got to do the life cycle assessment instead of, we don't want to just say, oh yeah, that sounds good, let's try it. You got to run the numbers, and that's not my forte.
Yeah. Well, that's
John,
an excellent. Yes, Mark.
Let me weigh in on that one, and just in a more simplistic way.
Sure.
As Xander had the list of things where it might be possible, I think we could come up with the same list. Is it sourced locally? Is it solving, your amendments, whatever they may be? Is it solving another ecological problem that we have? I'm thinking of excess nutrients that or concentrated animal feeding operations. Are we solving a water problem, a nitrogen problem elsewhere, and using the trees to remediate that? I think there's probably almost universal consensus that if that were done right, we could have a triple win. And I think looking at a broader scale approach is probably key to this.
And how would you elaborate by broader scale approach? What do you mean?
Okay, so you've got an ash problem at a biomass facility. That makes sense. So within a 5 or 10 mile defined area where transportation inputs are minimal and growth benefits are could justify it, we would use that. We would use, let's say, dry municipal waste solids, again within a 5 or 10 to 15 mile radius, whatever is determined sustainable. Likewise, if we had human or pig waste in excess, and the forest could be used as an amelioration of that problem, we could justify amendments in that regard because of the life cycle carbon changes or savings that we'd have from another production facility. So I think to the extent that we keep our mind open and broad, if these solutions solve an existing or additional ecological problem, put people to work, save fossil fuel in the mix, then it's a win-win for a number of problems. So I think having a broad and open perspective on solutions like that, because it's not going to get any easier, and just by having a moratorium or a dictate that says no fertilization, we're losing on some real winning opportunities. Again, the right place, keeping it local, keeping it smart, keeping it sustainable.
It's very interesting, Mark and Xander. Thank you both for those comments. I'll echo or just touch back that appreciate, Xander, you're emphasizing the importance of really running the numbers and taking care to scrutinize the idea before we take action, such as through life cycle analysis. And on Tuesday we had a wonderful discussion, an introduction of carbon life cycle analysis, and I would refer listeners to that webinar. And Mark, I also appreciate your highlighting the problem with confined animal feeding operations and the possibility that they may be a partial solution for soil enrichment of woodlands. I will note that I once had an ecologist tell me that he expected that southeastern forests, in particular the Appalachian forests, have probably been suffering since we humans got rid of the passenger pigeon, because those massive clouds of birds that darkened the skies would deposit nutrients in those forests, which are no longer being deposited. And so I think it basically this past couple of questions and responses reminds me just how really important it is that we carefully think through all of these implications, and where something that would seem so intuitive to disallow fertilization might actually have negative ecological implications. Xander, I have another question for you.
Sure.
Setting aside the question of biomass, because frankly, in the grand scheme of things, biomass, as we view it, the biomass feedstock for bioenergy, is such a very marginal aspect of forests, forest economics, and forest ecology. I'm wondering, what stronger policies might we consider to help keep forests, keep woodlands in continued forest use, continued forest land use?
Well, so a key piece is taxes, making sure the tax incentive structure benefits forest landowners, and this is not to give them some free ride, but rather to acknowledge the sort of common goods that forests provide. So we all benefit by having forests as forests, and the tax structure should recognize that. And in many places it does, but as municipalities or counties, states, even the federal government thinks about, wow, we need to get more revenue from here or there, sometimes a marginal development seems like a good idea because it might bring in new tax revenue, but the long-term implications of converting a forest to strip mall or something like that, or even houses, can be very negative. So that's one piece. The other piece is giving forest products their due as bioproducts. What Mark was talking about in terms of using wood for construction, it has a number of benefits outside of just the carbon that he talked about in terms of using local products and reduce costs. And so to make sure that when we're thinking about our construction and our code choices, our building code choices, that those should acknowledge the benefits of wood, because where there are markets, people will provide the products to fill those markets. So forest landowners will keep their land as forest because they know, hey, I'm going to be able to sell this material. So I think many of these, what I'm bringing up, are kind of the economic side of things, and I think that that's a big driver in how forest landowners make decisions. There are a lot of planning issues, zoning issues about how we allow urban areas, suburban areas to expand, and how we decide where those costs go. Are the costs of providing utilities to an ex-burb, a suburb on the fringes, being fully appropriated to the cost of construction? Are we recognizing the lost opportunities of converting forest land? So that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but I think that's the best I can do. Anything we can do to support the economics of forestry and help forest landowners do good forestry, I think helps keep forests as forests. There are other things. I mean, I should mention things like conservation easements. Here at the Forest Guild, we're very in favor of conservation easements that include working forest aspects. So not just saying we're going to put up a fence and protect this land, but rather we're going to have an easement that keeps it essentially working as it is. So continues to allow us to remove timber or keep it in the land base. And so I think those are becoming very effective. And one last idea that I'll bring from where I'm sitting right now, which is Santa Fe, New Mexico, and that is trying to connect the ecosystem services that forests are providing with those people using them. Here in our city, it's all about water. And so we have a system where those of us who use water here in Santa Fe actually pay for forestry in the upper watershed. And that's used in some places to conserve forest parcels in the upper watershed, but it's recognizing this sort of what has been for a long time a free forest product, in the same way carbon markets are kind of capturing that carbon sequestration. So I think all these strategies together can help us get to a place where forests are encouraged to stay on forests as forests.
Well, I hope you're right, and we've reached the end of our window, and I did want to thank Mark McGallis and Xander Evans again for sharing your time and your expertise with this audience. I also want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today and for your participation. For more information on this series, please check out our website at www.cleanenergy.org. Today's presentation has been recorded and will be available both on YouTube and on the webinar archive page of SACE's website. We will also send you a link to that recording once it has been processed if you had RSVP'd. And we appreciate your support and interest and hope that you'll join us again. Thank you so much. I'll end the broadcast now.